All right, well, hello, friends. Welcome. How are we doing?
Good.
Good. It has been a crazy 12 hours for me for a couple of reasons. One, at 8 o'clock last night, I had to preach a sermon, a different sermon, to a group of high school students on judging one another. Fast forward a few hours of sleep, and this morning I am preaching on Romans, submitting to authorities. And so right now I'm batting about a 500. I did not throw up for my sermon last night, but this morning I did throw up, which is probably good that there's nobody in these first couple of rows. But today I'm preaching on authority, on submitting to authority. And this is a passage that for myself is particularly challenging, because throughout my entire life I've struggled with authority. From my get-go, whether it was parents or teachers or coaches, I've always struggled with the authorities that have been placed above me. And you see this from an early age. Even with my first run-in with authority was the Easter Bunny. Many of you may not think this was an authority, but think about it. I mean, the Easter Bunny rewards you for being good, and if you're bad, you get less stuff. And so here it was, I'm 5 years old, and my life has recently been invaded by a sibling that's much cuter than me, my little sister. And so there's this phenomenon that when we're looking through old family albums, people notice, they're like, oh, Joe, you're so cute. And I was kind of cute. I wasn't exceptionally cute, but that's a nice thing to say. But then it happens. July 12th, 1991. My little sister enters the world. Bright blonde hair, blue eyes, the cutest child. And so as you're flipping through these albums, you cannot help but look at my sister. She's much cuter than me. And so I had noticed, even at an early age, that all the attention had been moved from myself to my sister. And so waking up early Easter morning, I was thinking to myself, you know, maybe the Easter Bunny has been affected by this celestial realignment. Maybe the Easter Bunny really likes my sister more than he likes me. And so I woke up early and I decided I was going to take matters in my own hand. And so I snuck into the living room. I found our Easter baskets there, perfect aligned. And I picked up all of my sister's candy and I dumped it into my own hand. And then I snuck back into my room and pretended to be asleep. 2 hours later, I wake to Joseph William Ratterman. Get in here. Turns out my parents were not very excited. They were very upset. I spent the entire Easter locked in my room, and my sister got all of my candy. So this was just the beginning. This was the beginning of my struggles with authority. You know, in elementary school, every parent-teacher conference ended the same way. My parents would get dressed up, they'd go, they'd come back, I'd get grounded. In high school, it was detention after detention. I got 13 detentions. On the school bus, got kicked off the school bus 3 different times. In every place that authority was placed over me, I struggled with it. It was because I couldn't trust it. I thought my teachers were out to get me. I thought my parents were out to get me. And I think this is something, for myself, it's been a lifelong struggle, but for those of us in the room, I think this is a struggle we all have. As millennial American Protestants. It's in our DNA. Millennials, the defining characteristic, you know, a distrust of authority. Americans, our country was formed out of rebellion. And as Protestants, the word Protestant means to protest. And so for those of us here, this is in our blood. We are a rebellious people. As we look into, you know, the newspapers today, I think that's very evident. We struggle with our governing authorities. You know, our streets are once again filled with the riots in Baltimore over a case of police brutality. And I just saw this the other day. Mike Huckabee and some other religious leaders are threatening civil disobedience if the Supreme Court decides that states can't ban same-sex marriage. So clearly this is an issue that we're not above. Clearly this is an issue that we struggle with. So how are we as God's people to deal with this? How are we as God's people to understand submitting to our governing authorities? Well, the passage we're going to look at today is found in Romans 13. It is the longest passage dealing with submitting to our governing authorities. But before we dive in, let's just take a moment and pray. Father, we love you. Lord, we acknowledge that you have created a world in which submission is absolutely necessary, in which there are constantly people above us. And Father, today we seek just your face, your will as to how we should relate to our governing authorities. So, Father, I pray that although there will be great tension with this message, that you lay it heavy upon our hearts, that we would see things as you see them and understand them as you understand them. And it's in your Son's holy and mighty name that we pray. Amen. All right, well, join me in Romans 13. Paul says, "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, For there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. When you have no fear of the one who is in authority, then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the wrongdoer. Therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. For because of this, you also pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God, attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them, taxes to whom taxes are owed, revenue to whom revenue is owed, respect to whom respect is owed, honor to whom honor is owed. Well, if you guys are anything like me, when I read this text, immediately my brain is flooded with questions. Immediately I start thinking, what about this? What about abuses of power? We've lived in a context in which we've seen such abuse of power throughout the ages. And so we come across this text where it says submit to the government, and there's something that stirs within us. And as we discussed our DNA, there's something that stirs within us that says, well, what about this? And while I'd love to resolve this tension immediately, because I feel like it's distracting even as we read these words, we're constantly thinking about this. I think for the sake of Paul and for his argument, we have to leave the elephant in the room. We have to deal with the tension at a later point. So I want us to grapple with this tension of, well, what about this? So first off, as we dive into the text, what is the context? As some of you guys have mentioned before, this passage stands in the thrust of the great therefore. In the previous 11 chapters, Paul's laid out a systematic theology of the gospel, how we are to live in light of the reality of the person and work of Jesus Christ. And then in chapter 12, there's this great word, therefore. In light of all of this reality, how does this change? How are we to live our lives differently? And he talks about living our life as a living sacrifice, and the unity of the church, and letting love be genuine. And then right here, in light of this reality of all that Christ has done, how are we to relate to the government? Now that we are citizens of a kingdom that's not of this world, how are we to relate to being citizens in this world? And so Paul dives in. He starts off, he says, let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists the authorities resists what God has appointed. And those who resist will incur judgment. So the lens that Paul wants us to see this text with is the idea that God governs the government. You see this all throughout his passage. There's no mistaking that this is the grounds by which he's causing us to look at this passage. He repeats this 6 times in 6 different ways. He says, no authority except from God, instituted by God, what God has appointed, God's servant, servant of God, ministers of God. He wants us to view the government in this way, that God governs the government, that he has established this. And this is an idea that's not new to Paul. This isn't something that he made up right on the spot. This is something we find all throughout the Old Testament. Starting in the Garden of Eden, God caused the world into existence. And he wasn't a watchmaker God that just created it and took a step back, but he's a God that actively maintains it, that is actively engaged in it. And so the reason stands that God governs the government because he established the world and he's still an active participant in it. And so you see this all throughout the Old Testament. There's a number of passages. In Proverbs 8, 15 through 16, he says, by me kings reign, and rulers decree what is just. By me princes rule, and nobles all who govern justly. So he's saying that the authority of kings and princes, everyone who rules, that authority comes from God alone, because God is the ultimate authority. In Isaiah 45, 4 through 5, he's speaking to his servant Cyrus. He says, for the sake of my servant Jacob, and Israel my chosen, I call you by your name. I name you though you do not know me. I am the Lord, and there is no other beside me. There is no God. I equip you, though you do not know me. So here we find that even in the midst of an oppressive ruler like Cyrus, one who may not actually call out to the name of God, that he's saying that even though you don't know me, I am in control. I equip you. Your power comes from me. We also see it in Jeremiah 27, speaking of Nebuchadnezzar. It says, "It is I who by my great power and my outstretched arm have made the earth, with the men and the animals that are on the earth. And I give it to whoever it seems right to me. Now I've given all these lands into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. And I have given him also the beasts of the field to serve him. All the nations shall serve him, and his son and his grandson, until the time of his own land comes. Many nations and kings shall make him their slave." So here we see that God is telling Nebuchadnezzar that he has raised him up for this time, to be his force for judgment in the world. And in a season to come, he's going to tear his kingdom apart. So even in the midst of this chaos that God's people are experiencing, we discover that God is in control. He raises kings, he lowers kings. And so this is the theological lens that Paul wants us to address this passage with. He's speaking to an audience that in the midst of a great tax revolt, Tacitus tells us that in the mid-50s that there was incredible resistance to paying taxes that led to a revolt in AD 58. So he's clearly speaking to a setting in which there's chaos, zealot movements. Christ has just been crucified. We see such unjust things from the government. What he's encouraging his people with, first and foremost, is God is in control. God governs the government. And as I was thinking about this passage for us, we live in a different context. Here Paul is talking about an authoritarian government, where there's one guy who decides right and wrong, where one guy is in control. But we live in a context in which the majority decides what's right and wrong. We live in a context in which the people are invited into the governing process. And so how are we as Christians supposed to interact with the government? Well, if the logic still stands that God governs the government, then Christians have to be involved in the government. He has placed us here at this time in a place where we get to make a huge impact, where we get to influence the government. And so if you guys are anything like myself, I don't spend a lot of time researching candidates. I haven't voted in the local elections lately. That has been my position. So when I read this text and I see that God governs the government, that he's placed us in here, I'm instantly convicted. It's like, how can we go about not voting? How can we go about not understanding who we're placing above us? God's people throughout history would have loved that kind of opportunity to influence the oppressors that were above them. We get the opportunity to really influence government for good. And so as Christians, I think if we firmly see the government as God sees it, as Paul saw it, then we would be actively engaged in government. We would encourage our congregants to run for office. We encourage them to participate in local elections. Because God governs the government. And I think what Paul's getting across here is that model Christians should be model citizens. Model Christians should be model citizens. If we were to view the government as God views it, we would seek to be model citizens. But is this the only reason we're to obey the government? Because God governs it? Because he says so? Because he's in control? Paul gives us another reason. He goes on. He said, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear for the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval. For he is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for he does not bear the sword in vain. For he is the servant of God, an avenger who carries out God's wrath on the evildoer." Paul is essentially telling us here that the government is also really good for those that do good. And it is bad for those that do bad. It is God's force of judgment in this world. And so if you don't want to be afraid of your government, then do what's good. And so maybe some of you guys can associate with this. Maybe you guys have experienced this phenomenon. But, it's a nice day. You're cruising along. You're on the highway. Listen to your jams. And then in the median, you see a car. And you think for a second, you're like, maybe it's a car that's shut down. You're not quite sure. But as you approach quicker and quicker, you realize that is a copper. And so immediately your hands start sweating, your heart drops out of your chest, and you slam on the brakes. Anyone relate with that? Yeah, that's our reaction. And when I was thinking about it, I think this is what Paul's talking about. Growing up, my struggle with authorities also included the law. Between the age of 16 and 18, I got 8 tickets. I got a letter in the mail that said they were going to take away my license if I got one more speeding ticket. I was a speed demon. I just love speeding. And so to this day, I can be going 5 miles under the speed limit, and I see that cop, and I am slamming on the brake. It doesn't matter how fast I'm going. And it's because I've associated, governing authorities with fear. because I was always doing what was wrong. And so what Paul's telling us here is, hey, if you don't want to be afraid of the government, then do what's right. For he is your servant for good. And so when we look at this passage, he goes on and he says, essentially he says he's God's servant for your good. And I think this is something that we overlook. We've always been in the government, so we don't really appreciate all the benefits. But the government has enormous good for those of us in this room. You know, it provides vaccinations. That's pretty essential. I'm glad I'm not like getting taken out by polio or something right now. You know, it provides roads, protection from foreign armies. I can eat dinner and know that somebody's probably not going to come tear my door down. And if they did, I'd get a fair trial against them later. Our government provides us with enormous good. You know, it provides peace in the midst of chaos. And while our government isn't perfect by any means, it doesn't completely reflect, you know, God's will. It does curb some of the worst of human excess. Does anybody here like zombie movies? Everybody. Taylor does. Taylor doesn't like zombie movies?
No, sorry.
He has other redeeming qualities.
He has other redeeming qualities. Well, but my favorite thing about zombie movies, there's this scene in every single zombie movie. You know, the protagonists are getting to a point where they need to like get resources. The zombies have recently outbroken. And they enter into a grocery store, and it is absolute chaos. Like, people are throwing each other left and right. They're shooting each other. Zombies are flying out of, you know, the freezers. Like, it's absolute chaos. Everyone's doing what's right in their own eyes. They're stealing, they're taking whatever they can because there's nothing restraining them. It's complete chaos. The government is gone. Everyone is being their own judge and jury, and they're given context. I think this is the other benefit the government provides. It prevents that kind of chaos, because that is human nature, when everyone decides to do what is right in their own eyes. And you see this in the book of Judges, constantly, the people doing what's right in their own eyes. And I was thinking about us here, we may not do absolute chaos, but we decide to be our own judges and juries all the time. And I mean, how often do we say, you know, today I'm allowed to speed because I'm running late? Or we say, today I'm allowed to use somebody else's login on MLB to watch a game because I'm a poor seminary student. Or how often do we say, like, I want this song. Those artists, they make enough money. They don't need it anyways. You know, we make these kind of right and wrong decisions all the time, deciding to take the law into our own hands. And as I was thinking about this passage for us, I didn't want to preach this message like I hate it. I'm the guy that does all those things. You know, I'm the guy that really struggles with authority. But as I wrestled with this, and I wrestled with it, and I thought about asking these questions before God, I'd say he's absolutely saying, well, why would you speed? Like, leave earlier. You don't just get to have something because you want it. You have to pay for things. And as I looked at all these things, you know, the voice of the God who said, you know, he who is faithful in little is faithful in much. I think that's his point here. Like, model Christians are to be model citizens. If we think that the government is good for those who do good and bad for those who do bad, and that God governs it, then we should be model citizens, seeking to obey even in the little stuff. But now the elephant in the room is starting to get a little bit bigger. This sounds all good, you know, be a good Christian, do your voting, you know, be a model citizen. But what about when governments go bad? You know, what about those times where we've seen such terrible abuse? You know, when is it okay to disobey? And I think Paul has some grounds for it here, though not explicitly stated. In verse 5, he says, therefore, one must be in subjection, not only to avoid God's wrath, but also for the sake of conscience. And we just saw, you know, the wrath for when you do wrong, you're going to get punished. But the second part, he says, for the sake of conscience. Now, in the context, he's definitely talking about the conscience of knowing that God governs the government. That is the reason why we are to obey. But I think on the flip side, is recognizing that for the sake of conscience, it is okay to disobey at times. And the grounds for this, if you understand the word here is subjection, the root of it being ugotasso, it's a Greek word that doesn't mean the same thing as obey. Submit and obey are different things. And the way that they would have understood this in this context is that submit here means to recognize one's place in a hierarchy, to recognize one's place in an ordered structure. So on Paul's grounds here, recognizing that God governs the government, and he has placed them above us for our good, when those governing authorities are getting in the way of God's way, then it's okay to disobey. If you are a soldier in the army and a lieutenant orders you to do something against the direct commands of the general, submitting would look like disobeying your lieutenant for that time. Because our ultimate authority is God. God is our ultimate authority. So what I wanted to do is look at a few different passages that touch this issue of instances where it's okay to disobey. You know, we see this in Acts 5:29. The disciples, Peter and the other apostles, after the resurrection of Jesus, are going out proclaiming his name everywhere. And it's causing a stir among the people. And they're thrown before the religious authorities. And they're strictly commanded, do not preach Jesus' name. And then Paul, in a moment of boldness, he turns to them and he says, we must obey God over man. We must obey God over man. And so you see in this instance that Peter and the apostles, they understood that to obey authorities in this sense would get in God's way. It's okay to disobey when it gets in God's way. Another great example we see in Scripture is the story of Daniel. We see this 3 different times. First, he's commanded to eat food that would defile him before his God. There he disobeys. He's commanded to worship before an idol, and there he disobeys. He's commanded not to pray for 30 days, only to pray to the king. And instead, he prays 3 times a day. And in every instance, we see that Daniel recognizes his ultimate authority, and that submitting to the government in that sense meant disobeying, because those authorities have to answer to God at some point. And what would be great is to just stop right here, to be in this place and be like, because there's something that rises up in us. We're like, oh yeah, okay, the tension's relieved. We can just resist whenever it disagrees with our conscience. But I think there's another example that causes us pause. Another example that throws a wrench in this whole equation. And I think it's the example of Jesus. As we look at Jesus, Jesus interacted with his governing authorities. Jesus, the most just man that ever lived, sinless, spotless, the most amazing person who ever lived, received the most unjust punishment. To the point that Pontius Pilate said that I find nothing wrong with this man. And yet our Savior, the most perfect person that ever lived, was spat on, beaten to a pulp, humiliated, and then nailed to a cross. How are we to make sense of this? That was an unjust thing. How are we to make sense of this? And I think we find our answer in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus on the night that he was betrayed, or the night before he was betrayed, he and his disciples hanging out there. He's praying before God. He's sweating blood, and he's crying out, if it is not your will, take this cup from me. But nevertheless, your will, not mine. And I think it's this example that should cause us pause. That we have to put on the brakes when we think about disobeying the government. Because the most just person that ever lived had to sweat blood before he chose to submit to an unjust punishment. And so as we look at this, it's okay to disobey when it gets in God's way, but sometimes that may mean submitting to unjust rulers. That may mean submitting to unjust punishments. And I think that's what Paul's getting at. So in light of all this, understanding that God governs the government, that the government is good for those that do good, and it's bad for those that do bad, and that it's okay to disobey when it gets in God's way. What are we supposed to do in light of this? What does submitting to the government really look like? Fortunately, Paul tells us. In verse 6, he says, for because of this you pay taxes. For the authorities are ministers of God attending to this very thing. Pay to all what is owed to them. Taxes to whom taxes are owed. Revenue to whom revenue is owed. Respect to whom respect is owed. Honor to whom honor is owed. And so Paul starts off once again. He's explaining to us. He's putting our theological caps on. He's saying, these are the ministers of God. God governs the government. And this isn't something that we often do, thinking of our government in this way. How quick are we to bash our government? To bash the president, to bash Democrats, to bash Republicans, to critique their every move, to send that passive-aggressive Facebook status, to put that Bible verse in the midst of a political conversation on, Twitter or whatever. When are we going to figure out that doesn't work? That just does not work. That never results in God's glory when we put a little quick Bible verse in there. When I look at this text, I think For most of us in this room, we probably don't struggle with paying our taxes. That's pretty obvious. I imagine most of us pay our taxes. But the thing that we definitely struggle with is this second half, this respecting those that deserve respect and honor to those that deserve honor. And I think if we understood the government as God understands the government, as Paul understands the government, that he governs it, that they have to answer to him, we could not get away with the way that we treat them, the way that we passively aggressively undermine them all the time. So I think Paul is calling us here to be model Christians and model citizens. That if we understood the government in this way, that's the way that we would act. You know, I was thinking about a good way to end this, a good illustration of this, and recently heard of a church here in Colorado, I think it's in Aurora, that their head pastor approached the governor and asked, if there's one thing that we could do, you know, one thing that would make your life easier, one thing that would take a burden off of you, what would it be? And the governor said, we have an enormous problem with the foster care system. You know, we've got 800 kids that need good families to take care of them. And so the pastor, he went back to his local congregation. They committed to taking care of 10% of the problem. I think at the point they've already adopted over 100 of those kids. And then he petitioned a bunch of the churches around Denver to also help take care of the foster care problem. And now I think there's like 174 kids that are left in the foster care problem, or in the situation. Like, what would it look like for us as Christians to be a blessing to our government, to seek to lighten the load, you know, to be model Christians and model citizens? I think if we were doing this well, no longer would we be pushed to the fringes of influence. No longer would our church plants be kicked out of, you know, high schools. And I think we'd get to see some amazing good if model Christians were truly model citizens. All right, let's pray. Father, we love you. Lord, we acknowledge that you govern the government, that you are in control. In the midst of chaos at times, that you raise kings and you drop them to their knees. And Father, we know that you have placed us in a unique context in history where we get to be a part of that process. And so, Father, I pray that you would build in us a conviction to participate in our government, to seek to be a blessing, to pray for those above us. And Father, may your will be done here on earth. May you use us. It's your Son's holy name we pray. Amen.
Take a couple of minutes, then we're going to chat with Joe a little bit.